Alrighty. So we're going to talk about Noah after the flood. And I want to start by saying that you've heard some new things this morning. And it's okay to have questions about them. And it's okay to take time to process them. But I also want to say that as you process them and try to make sense and incorporate these things in your existing understanding of the Bible, I want to remind you that all of these things and some of the details are a part of a story. And there are some things that we don't have all the details on. And that's okay. Because what we need to focus on is the big picture. Are you with me? Yes. The story is trying to tell us something about who? God. It's trying to show us who God is. And so, like Peter's comment earlier, when he saw the pattern of our decline into sin, his point is, oh wow, so this is how God has to reset me in my life. So one of the things we learn from this pattern is that as humans, we tend to sin and to get worse. But God doesn't give up on us. God perseveres with us. And at times we need his intervention, both individually and collectively. And he's continuously doing that because he's trying to save us. So try to focus on the big picture. Remember, the Bible is a window, an analogy, that we're looking through to see God. It's important as we look through the window that we don't get stuck looking on the details of the window. That window pane is very dirty. Somebody kill a mosquito on it. It's a beautiful scene outside. We're wondering, what kind of wood this? Is UPVC and a real wood, And we're so caught up with the things that we're trying to figure out about the window that we're missing the picture, which is God. All right? God in his great wisdom only gave us as much as we needed. And there are things that he didn't tell us. I think I said the last time, my good friend Simon Brown, one of his favorite passages was Deuteronomy 29:29. Essentially, it says something like, the revealed things are for man, but the hidden things are for God. There are things in Scripture that are clear. That's where we must camp out. The things that are hidden and not disclosed to us, God knows them. You can leave them with him. And that's not to say that we are not entitled to ask questions and to wonder. The Scriptures are there for us to think about. And we can speculate and have discussions with each other. But remember, the big picture is what we're after. Does that help you? Yeah. All right, very good. Thank you. So you're going to see a lot of slides, and I'm not going to spend time on all of them because just based on where we're at, I'm going to move fairly quickly, and then we're going to try to have some Q&A as we go. So Noah after the flood. Then Noah built an altar, to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I'll never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I've done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So Noah comes off of the ark and he builds an altar. And his sacrifice seems to induce God's decision never again to curse the ground because of man. Now, I want you to notice that God knows that man has not really changed. Because he says, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. God didn't think that the flood was going to change man's heart. He just had to reset things. Things gone too bad. They tip over. So he's just kind of restarted. But when he restarts, he understands that he's still got to deal with the heart of man. But he makes a commitment that he's not going to bring another flood. And he comes up with a covenant as his plan for how he's going to deal with trying to redeem man. We were earlier told that he makes a covenant with Noah. And so here we're told, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they're delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. So this sounds like Genesis chapter 1, doesn't it? Where God says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And not only so, but notice he says that the fear of you and the dread of you will be on all the creatures. Now in Genesis 1, God simply says, rule and subdue the earth. But here, he's saying something has changed in the nature of man's relationship with the rest of creation, where the animals are now going to fear man. I think this points to some of the disharmony that sin has brought into creation. But ultimately what this is a picture of God starting over. This is a part of God's mercy, that he keeps starting over with us and that he makes all things new. A number of years ago, I had a high school friend who ran the joke with me. He'd had a divorce and he'd remarried, and he said, I needed a do-over. And, he laughed, and it's just a joke between friends. And I laughed with him because I understood he had a challenging marriage and he needed to start over. I don't know about you, but sometimes I need a do-over. You ever need a do-over? Start a day. It's just, you blow it in some sin, you lose it, you don't recognize yourself, and you wake up the next morning and the sun is up and you can have a new quiet time. And you say, God, forgive me. I blew it. I'm sorry. I'm going to try different today. And you have a do-over. Or about a new year. Sometimes a whole year is bad. You can just make some new resolution and, The only reason you're able to do any of that is because you understand something about the nature of God. You don't understand him as a God who say, but me see you from yesterday. All them things you do yesterday, I hold you up in my heart. God doesn't hold grudges. He's prepared to give us a do-over. And so he blesses Noah and his sons just like he did the humans at creation. This is a recreation, as we've been saying. This is the heart of God. God wants to bless us. That's what he says when he makes mankind in Genesis 1. It says that he blessed them. He said, be fruitful and multiply. He wants abundance for them. And when he starts over with Noah, he says the same thing. He blesses them and he wants them to enjoy the blessing of creation. And he says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Now, it's not that man's commission to rule over the earth has been removed. It's that something has changed in the nature of man's relationship with the rest of creation, why fear is the means by which man will prevail over them. And I think this is because man is violent. And so the other creatures are not harmoniously submitting to man's rule, but are hostile to humans and will now only submit out of fear. And then God gives the animals now as food to humans. And I think what happened is they started eating animals. And God says, okay, I will allow you to. But just don't eat the animals with the blood in it. And then he says, the next thing is, you got to make sure, well, that's what he says in verse 4 to 5. You shall not eat flesh with his life, that is his blood. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every beast. I'll require it, and from man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. So let's deal with the blood thing. The idea was that they understood that the essence of an animal's life was in its blood. And so they would drink the blood because they're trying to get the life force from the animal. And God says, none of that. What you do is you kill an animal, you pour out the blood as an offering to me because I'm God. But the next thing that he deals with is the fact that he says, anybody who kills a man, whether human or beast, I will require a reckoning. Now understand that murder has been going on from before, but God had not imposed capital punishment. Now God is saying, all right, this is how we're going to deal with this stuff now. Any more killing that goes on, you're going to have to answer personally to me. So God is making all of these provisions to deal with the fact that man is still fallen, even after he has restarted creation after the flood. And God says, whoever sheds the blood of man by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. And the idea here is that God is saying the reason why you cannot kill a man and why I will require reckoning for a man's blood is that man is made in the image of God. And that tells us that even after the flood, mankind is still made in God's image, because I think it is largely about the role that God has given man. Man represents God's authority over creation and his ruling presence in the world. And so to attack man is to attack the authority of God. And God is dealing with the violence of humans, not by means of another flood, but by means of, let's call it, social legislation to try and keep it in check. But notice the repetition of being made in God's image with the commission to be fruitful and multiply, making a frame around Genesis 9:1 and 9:7. It's all about God recommissioning men as his image bearers. Then God does something new. He enters into a covenant with Noah and his sons and their offspring and all the animals, that he will never again cut off all the flesh or destroy the earth by a flood. And he gives a rainbow as a sign of this covenant. That doesn't mean that there were no rainbows before. It means that God is now using the rainbow as a sign of his covenant, that he will no longer destroy the earth by the flood. Now, in this covenant, the covenant is an agreement, but God's covenant is unilateral. He's the only one making a promise. And the rainbow is a sign of this covenant. And the Hebrew word for rainbow, kesset, is the same word for bow as in bow and arrow. And so some understand God to be saying he's hanging up his bow and arrow. He's pointing it to the sky and not to mankind, as he's no longer going to be at war with humankind as he was in the flood. And Noah, I think, needs this reassurance because perhaps one author suggested he's been traumatized by the flood. Noah fears that God's going to do it again. And you know why he fears that? Because sin is in him. And he thinks if things get out of hand, which we will see very shortly it does, will God come and wipe us out again? It's kind of like, after a hurricane. You start feeling like, okay, category 4, just passed a little south of us. If it come a little bit more north, Kingston would have mash up. You're wondering, my goodness, I guess I'm really fairly insecure in this world. I think Noah would have felt fairly insecure after the flood. And I think God gives him a reassurance, okay, you may get some rain, but I promise you it won't get that bad again because I'm hanging the rainbow in the clouds. Now, one of the lenses through which I think we can better understand the message of Genesis and the flood is by comparing the flood's narrative to other ancient Near East flood accounts. I don't know if you know this, but there are other flood accounts. I think Eddie was mentioning the fact earlier that there are other flood accounts. In the 19th century, archaeologists in Mesopotamia, that's basically roughly Iraq in our modern world, discovered a number of clay tablets inscribed with Mesopotamian texts written in what is called cuneiform. It's a kind of wedge-shaped script. And a number of these texts included flood stories with a number of similarities to the Genesis flood account. The most significant of these is the Gilgamesh epic. Remember talking about Gilgamesh, the half-human, half-divine warrior king who was the king of Uruk? Well, a part of his story includes a story of a flood. And there is as well the Atrahasis epic, where the flood hero's name is Atrahasis. And there's also a short flood account in the Eridu Genesis. So all of these stories have some similarities to the actual biblical flood account. We're going to talk about what we can learn from that. The most famous of these is the Gilgamesh epic, as I said earlier. I won't tell you too much about that story, but it's very interesting. And tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic is the part of the story where the flood account is found, and you can actually see it in the British Museum. This is a reproduction here of tablet 11. So here are a couple extracts from the Gilgamesh epic, which I think can help us understand the difference with the biblical story and what the biblical story is telling us about God. So when the gods, basically the gods decide, let's put some of these stories together. In Atrahasis' epic, we're told the reason why the gods start the flood is because humans are making too much noise. So they create the humans because they need someone to do the work that the lesser gods don't want to do and had striked. They weren't strike, they weren't doing it. So the gods create the humans to do the work, and the humans start doing the work, but the God who is of the earth, they're making too much noise in his ears. So he says, you know what? We need to wipe them out. And so they say, we're going to bring a flood. And then now what happens is the God from the subterranean waters, a God called Enki, goes, and he's been on embargo not to tell about the flood. So what he does is he goes to the house of the flood era, Utnapishtim, and he says, house, tear down yourself and use your reeds and build an ark, because, not an ark, a boat, because, a flood is going to come. So in this way, he tells the hero, who overhears what he says to the house, so the God is being deceitful, how to build this boat to avoid the flood. So Utnapishtim builds a boat, gets people on it, and then the flood comes. And then we're told the gods were frightened by the deluge, and shrinking back, they ascended to the heaven of Anu. Anu is the heavenly God. He's all the way up the top. And the gods cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall. So they're being smashed up in the top of the heavens against the firmament because they're trying to get away from the water. The gods, all humbled, sit and weep, their lips drawn tight, one and all. Now, when you compare that to the biblical flood account, in the biblical story, God is in complete control. He remembers Noah, and he causes the flood to recede with his wind or breath, like at the beginning of creation. But here we have these gods. They start this flood, and the flood is in control of them. And we're told that they're cowering like dogs. And then we have a second extract that shows the God's response to the flood hero sacrifice. So just like in the flood account in Genesis, the hero of the flood account in Gilgamesh makes a sacrifice. But the gods are all hungry because in their conception of the gods depend on the humans to get food. And so because they haven't had food for, I think the flood is about 7 days in their account, we're told that the hero says, then I let out all to the four winds and offer the sacrifice. I poured out a libation on the top of the mountain. 7 and 7 cold vessels I set up. Upon their pot stands I heaped cane, cedar wood, and myrtle. The gods smelled the favor. The gods smelled the sweet favor. The gods crowded like flies about the sacrificer. They're hungry. And because they're so hungry, they crowd around this little altar that Utnapishtim has made. And then we have a similar account to the flood account in that the hero also sends out birds. When the 7th day arrived, I sent forth and set free a dove. The dove went forth but came back. Since no resting place for it was visible, she turned round. Then I sent forth and set free a swallow. The swallow went forth but came back. Since no resting place for it was visible, she turned round. Then I sent forth and set free a raven. The raven went forth, and seeing that the waters had diminished, he eats, circles, caws, and turns not round. You notice how similar this is to the Genesis flood account? So we have a dove and a raven, and maybe what is added is a swallow. So there are a number of elements that we can point to between the Genesis account and the other Mesopotamian flood accounts. For instance, there is a divine decision to destroy mankind. But in the Mesopotamian flood stories, it's not one God, but many gods. And accounts of gods destroy mankind because they're multiplying and making too much noise. Whereas in the Genesis account, God is wiping out mankind because of evil, for a moral reason. There is a warning to a flood hero. In the Mesopotamian accounts, the flood hero is tipped off by speaking to his house. By contrast, God warns Noah not with any subterfuge, not because he's his favorite, but because Noah is righteous. And God shows him grace and favor, and only Noah's family is saved. There's a command to build the ark, and we talked a little bit earlier about the different shapes of the ark. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero Utnapishtim shuts the door. In Genesis, Noah is saved by divine grace, not by wisdom or heroic efforts, and so God shuts him in. There is the description of the flood. It's about 7 days and 7 nights in the Mesopotamian accounts, and of course, much longer in the biblical accounts. And then there's the birds, there's the divine smell of the sacrifice we talked about earlier, and there is the blessing on the flood hero. In the Mesopotamian accounts, the gods have to resolve amongst themselves whether they should be upset that one person survived, and they decide, okay, you know what, let's control population going forward. Certain women should be celibate, others infertile. Infants should die soon after birth, whereas in Genesis, God says, multiply and be fruitful. God is about increase and blessing mankind. So, Gordon Wenham says, through the flood story then, Genesis paints a completely different portrait of God from the standard ancient theology. Most obviously, there's only one God. This means that all power belongs to him. It's not shared out unequally among different members of a pantheon, but just as important is the character of the divinity revealed by the flood story. He's still personal. Anthropomorphic language is freely used. Anthropomorphic language means language to describe God in human terms. Not saying it's human, like for example, we say God has a face. God doesn't have a face, he's spirit, but we use that so that we can describe something about him in human terms. That language is freely used to describe God's thoughts and attitudes. So God is a personal God. But the failings that too often characterize humanity and the Babylonian deities are eliminated. God is not like humans in divine form. And so God is not fearful. He's not ignorant. He's not greedy. He's not jealous. He's not annoyed by man's rowdiness, but by his depravity. Not partiality, but justice dictates the salvation of Noah. And so the idea here is not that the Genesis account is borrowing from these Mesopotamian accounts. They exist within the same cultural river. And what's going on is that I think there was a flood, and there are all these different cultures having stories about the flood. And the Genesis account tells the story of the flood in a way that describes a God that is very different than the gods around them. We have a God who, when we compare him to the Mesopotamian accounts, we see that he is a far superior God. And so from the short summary, we can detect a number of similarities as well as a number of differences. And there's no reason to doubt that the ancient Near Eastern accounts and Genesis refer to the same flood. This would certainly account for the similarities. The differences exist because each culture is viewing the flood through its own theology and worldview. So if someone says, oh, but there are lots of flood accounts, no need to dispute that. That is true. The question is, what does the Bible say about the flood? The Bible's story does not come out of these other flood stories. It is God telling us who he is through the flood story, which is his account of the meaning of the event that these other cultures were describing as well. So the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from these, the people of the whole earth were dispersed. So God is starting over with Noah and his sons, and from them the plan is to spread out over all the earth as it was in Genesis 1. Now Noah, remember, is a hope for God to grant us relief from the curse of the ground. And so we read now expecting Noah Know that God has started everything over to be the seed of the woman who's going to deal with evil at its source. Well, I think you know how the story goes. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. So the fact that Noah begins to be a man of the soil, that word soil is Adamah, is the same word that Adam is made from. So he's been compared to Adam. And he plants a vineyard, this is a garden, like the garden that Adam and Eve were put in. He drinks the fruit of the garden, like Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the garden they were put in. He gets drunk and lays uncovered in his tent, and uncovered, of course, reminds us of Adam and Eve realizing that they were naked. And then Ham, one of Noah's sons, saw, like Eve saw what was good in her eyes, Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his brothers outside. And there is some question as to what the passage means when it says that he saw his father's nakedness. Now, I'm not going to get too much into that. Some suggest that Ham's sin was some kind of voyeurism. Some suggest that the sin here is voyeurism. Voyeurism is being a peeping Tom. Yeah. Some suggest that, it was the question why? Did somebody ask why? No?
No.
Okay. And the idea is the fact that he saw his father's nakedness. What does that mean? Was he just looking? And then some suggest that maybe it's some kind of incest, because you have passages like Leviticus 18, 6 to 19, and a couple places in chapter 20 and in Ezekiel, which refers to uncovering the nakedness of someone to refer to some kind of fornication or heterosexual intercourse with a relative. But I think the problem with that meaning is when Shem and Japheth cover up their dad, how does that rectify what Ham had done wrong, other than being the reverse of simply looking on his father and coming and tell them? Do you see what I'm saying? And so I tend to go with the simple explanation. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, walked backward, covered the nakedness of their dad. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. I think the idea is that what Ham did was he dishonored his father. He should not have gone to his brothers and mocked his dad in his moment of weakness. And so when Noah woke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Now, I think this is the part that makes people think something happened, because it says he awoke, he knew what his youngest son had done to him, and then he curses Canaan, who is a son, and not Ham himself. But I think what we're dealing with is, I think he hears what his son did in terms of mocking him. And I think he curses Canaan because the point is, one, that in the same way that Ham sinned against his father, the sin of the curse falls on Ham through his son. Are you following what I'm saying? In other words, it's a reciprocal effect of the effect of the sin. And also, I think part of it is, this is a story about Israel, and they're going to be going into Canaan. And the point is that this is explaining why the Canaanites had to receive the judgment of God. They're under this curse because of their descent from Ham, who we are told sinned against his dad in this way. But Noah not only curses Ham, he blesses Shem. He says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." So whereas Canaan is cursed, Shem is exalted over Canaan. And the Israelites descend from Shem. That's why they are Semites, as in the term anti-Semitism. And this explains the prevalence that they have over the Canaanites in the biblical story. So when we look at what happens after the flood, again, the pattern helps us to see what the story is telling us. God creates an ordered world. He puts Noah and his family in it, just like he did Adam and Eve in the garden. He begins on a mountain, because the ark lands on a mountain. He blesses them, like in Genesis 1, and tells them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And Noah starts well by sacrificing on a mountaintop altar. But then he's like Adam, a man of the soil. He farms land, he tills the soil like Adam does the garden. He plants a vineyard, which is a garden. He drinks of the wine, the fruit of the vineyard, and he becomes drunk, lays uncovered, naked in his tent, just like Adam and Eve discovered they're naked, resulting in shame because they realized that they were naked. And then his son sees his father's nakedness, and some say some kind of grievous sexual offense. I think we can say we're dealing really with his dishonoring his dad, dividing him from his brothers, and splitting the family life. Noah wakes, knows what his son had done. He curses Canaan, and from Noah comes all the nations of the world. So the point is, Noah is not the seed who is to come. Noah, as promising as he starts out, ends up just like Adam and Eve. And so we're back to Adam and Eve in the garden again, but what we have now is a scaling up of sin over time until corporately things get so bad that God has to hit the reset button.